Hi, I'm Ante Jeroncic and welcome to the Craft of Living. It is certainly good to be back and it has been a very interesting week on my end. I hope that you guys are doing well whenever you end up listening to this episode. I had some bad news on my end, some family members struggling with health issues and trying to process all of that. Obviously deeply concerned about my parents that are getting older and some other friends and people that are struggling on the health side of their life. But otherwise, things have been good. Weather is still very cold here, plenty of amazing snow and a lot of skiing, cross-country skiing, which has been great. Ample opportunities for cold weather exposure for those of you who live in such climates, and I have to be mindful that not everyone is surrounded by, lives in the context of a polar vortex or even lives in a climate where you have snow, and I have to kind of be mindful of the global nature perhaps of my audience. But it doesn't really matter. This is just a context in which I live. But I do need to say perhaps that, in the context of, cold water immersion, ice water immersion, the cold exposure in general. I've been talking about it on and off in the last couple of episodes, and I failed to mention, and I actually had the book here, but I failed to mention the person who provided a spark for me to think in those directions, in those terms of experimenting with breathing and cold weather exposure or cold exposure. And then that is no other than Wim Hof. Many of you will be familiar with Wim Hof. If not, he is the ground zero, perhaps not the ground zero. There have been other people who have been experimenting and have been showing the benefits of cold exposure. But certainly Wim Hof with his multiple records, Guinness Book of Records, where I think his record was, okay, I should have written this down, but I think 1 hour and 48 or 1 hour 53 minutes immersed in ice cubes. That record was, I think, eventually broken by another person. It might have been an Austrian and a Russian, I believe, first Russian and an Austrian. But can you imagine just being in ice, right, for over 2 hours? This is absolutely crazy. People who are able to endure such things. But this is not about extremes. This is not about such unbelievable feats. This is really more about putting our body in environments in which we need to learn to adapt, in which we have to learn how to deal with the cold, as my small video that I shot the other day really illustrates. Okay, so it's 20 degrees outside. We had some amazing snow, and this is time for a small walk in the neighborhood. I think one of the reasons I like walking in snow, it's just beautiful and peaceful. But also, as we deal with, coldness, in the first minute or so are always suffering. But then, you get used to it. One way you walk in cold is you don't fight the cold. You simply notice the experience that's taking place. Obviously, you cannot be too long outside in such temperatures, especially the feet get cold very fast. But it is lovely, it is beautiful, it is, a training in accepting things as they come our way, right? Sometimes not to fight them, and sometimes not to be all uptight about it. In certain, practices of mindfulness, there's the saying, what you resist persists. And so, this is a lesson to be learned. You don't have to be a Buddhist, a Hindu, a yogi, whatever, to understand those principles. Those are principles of the spirit, of physiology. And we can apply them to everyday life. So yeah, go outside, enjoy nature, enjoy the snow. Peace. Okay, this was not the best of productions, but it was a spur of a moment thing. I went outside and said, well, let me record this for posterity, as if anyone will ever listen to this, but it doesn't really matter. So this is kind of my thing. And in Wim Hof, you can, again, as I said, you can find out about him. BBC has done some interesting, reporting on him, and there are many clips. He has an app. You can subscribe to things. But in general, Wim Hof is really the person who has been an inspiration and what he has achieved. But perhaps more importantly, or not more importantly, but equally importantly, there's a book that came out on this topic by Scott Kearney, What Doesn't Kill Us. And the subtitle of this book is How Freezing Water, Extreme Altitude, and Environmental Conditioning Will Renew Our Lost Evolutionary Strength. So, and he talks about this, how he went out to debunk some of these feats that Wim Hof proclaimed, and kind of this almost guru-like status that he has acquired, and he went to kind of debunk it. And he ended up, this journalist, right, Scott Kearney ended up climbing himself Mount Kilimanjaro without any clothing on, and he is a strong proponent of the many things that Wim Hof is sharing. So I thought to perhaps just alert you of this, and also share with you a tiny clip, which, I hope it will not infringe any sort of copyright requirements, because I'm using it for educational purposes. But here is a small clip that Scott Kearney did in promotion for his book. It became a New York Times bestseller and came out in 2017.
I traveled to Poland to expose a charlatan, a prophet who claimed he could give ordinary people superpowers. He said he could control his body temperature at will, hijack his immune system, and conquer the world's tallest mountains with no cold weather gear. I'd built my career as an investigative journalist debunking people like him. But to prove he was a liar or a madman, I had to try his method. I'm not an athlete, I'm not exceptional, but I found a power that I never knew humans had. I hiked to the summit of Mount Kilimanjaro without a shirt. I sat on the snowy bank of a river until the ice melted around me. I trained with top athletes. I crossed the finish line of the world's most notorious cold weather obstacle course race wearing nothing but shorts and a smile. I could do 80 push-ups on a single breath, and I lost 7 pounds of fat in 7 days. If I can do it, anyone can.
Enough of this. I think I am done with bothering you with all of this topic, except as to say that I have again stumbled upon a lovely video produced by a wonderful reblogger, artist, photographer, Jonna Hinton from Sweden. And it is a wonderful documentary about her living just below the Arctic Circle in Sweden, and this kind of undulation of nature, winter, summer, spring, all the seasons of the year, fall, of course, the beautiful sun exposure, the beautiful nature, and both in winter and summer. It's just a lovely documentary that she did, and I will provide you a link. Just look it up. I posted this on my Facebook, and I posted this actually on my blog as well, because I found it very inspiring, the way she writes about these kind of changes, right? The changes, the shifts of nature, the cycle of nature, the importance of self-care, being connected with the wider world. It's just a very, very nice video, very nicely done. I recommend it to you. Just have a look at it. But especially I want to share with you a clip in which she shares one of her favorite winter routine. And here it is. So leaving this behind, this has been also an important week for me on another level. As you might know, I've been working on a book. I'm working on a book on existential epistemology. I tentatively titled the book Living Truth, where I explore the question of what does it mean to access truth and what does it mean to properly account for the operations of truth. It's very kind of, sounds academic and all of that, but basically it revolves around the question like, who is worthy of truth? How to become worthy of truth? Who do we need to be to fully understand the truth as it is for me at a particular circumstance? The openness to truth and the closures to truth and all of these questions, obviously questions of ignorance and types of blameworthy ignorance, and what is it about a contemporary culture that perhaps really accentuates this closure to truth, and all of these questions. I'm deeply interested in that. So that has been my focus, and understandably I've been reading quite a bit of stuff on that. And a book that I referenced in the past, Lee McIntyre's Post-Truth, I just went through it this week. Very nice book, really tries to provide a genealogy, a story of this post-truth environment in which we live. And he looks at, obviously, at social media. But one thing that is quite interesting that I never really understood, he really examines a little bit the playbook of the tobacco industry, whose strategy in the 50s was when the first studies started coming out about the ill effects of tobacco, that they tried to muddle the scientific waters, right? So they're sponsoring studies which then provide alternative results and creating this kind of illusion that we don't have the final word. We have this voice and this voice, so we cannot really arrive at a conclusion. And they've been able to use this playbook, right, by muddling the water, by creating insecurity for another 40 years, essentially, right? And then he tracks how this very same playbook of introducing discordant voices which are then amplified, and in order to create the illusion that actually we cannot make up our mind what the state of affairs is. That the same kind of playbook has been used by people heavily invested, economically invested in denying the almost unanimous consent of climate scientists about global warming. And you can see that, right? And basically any issue that you have, there's always some expert somewhere, right? Be it on vaccination, be it on this, and be it, always somewhere, someone who has, the kind of a discordant voice and who kind of looks through, the official narrative, and not only then leaves the impression that he or she has the solution, but at the very least creates the illusion that we cannot possibly know what the right answer might be given these multiplicity of voices. I think that was quite interesting. I really enjoyed reading that. And so that was one thing. And obviously part of the book he talks quite a bit about conspiracy theories. And I have to say, this is for me an interesting thing. Right? I often talk to people, and I've learned that people who are completely immersed, as you know, friends, right? People who are immersed in certain conspiracy theories, that they don't see them as conspiracy theories. First of all, they see them as, really true accounts of the state of affairs in which we find ourselves. So they don't see it that way. But one question that I like to ask them, like give me one counterfactual. Like give me one bit of information that would lead you to rethink, right, your position. Who would have to say that? What would it be? And it's interesting the responses that people give. And one positive, perhaps, glimmer of hope is that the negative thing first is, right, we know about confirmation bias, and we know about the bunkering down effect, where people actually, when they hear counterfactuals or they hear information that opposes their convictions, they actually become even more entrenched in the beliefs that they have, right? But studies have shown that while that indeed is the case, that if you dialogue with people, and if people are continually exposed to alternative interpretations, that eventually those alternative viewpoints have a positive effect. So I think that was quite interesting for me to read. So I've been reading, that was interesting to read. But I've been studying and reading and exploring and thinking about this issue of conspiracy theories. And I said before, I started saying it and then I kind of had a brief detour, that one person who really inoculated me against conspiracy theories is Umberto Eco. His book, The Name of the Rose, I read it as a college student, remains to this day one of my absolutely favorite works of fiction. It's just amazing. Anyone who loves, crime story combined with the setting in a medieval monastery, a lot of these philosophical and theological debates, about reality and realism, you have all of this going on. A phenomenal book. But the book is all about a warning of how very easy it is to read quote-unquote science, to construct science, to bring science together in such a way in which they provide a coherent narrative. Right? And science might be, science in nature, science in texts, it might be all kinds of different things. But as a semiotician, he's very much interested in those kind of themes. Umberto Eco is. So the book is an excellent illustration. And then after that, I read his book, The Foucault's Pendulum, which is quite a bit thicker. In this edition, it goes well over 600 pages. And it is a bizarre book about all kinds of things, the Templars, the Illuminati, and all of that. But again, this understanding that if people accept like a basic premise about something, right? You just accept a basic premise. How on that foundation of that premise, you can build up all kinds of theories which are absolutely intrinsically coherent. And so people who subscribe to the coherence theory of truth, and perhaps that is not fair, but people who see coherence as one of the major sort of, way of how we ought to think about whether something is true or not, well, that then becomes really problematic, because you have many of these conspiracy theories are very coherent once you perhaps accept one or two premises. So that was quite interesting for me to think about it and explore that. And in light of that, I was really intrigued. There was an article that came out in the recent edition of the New York Review of Books on a book published by Richard Evans, Hitler's Conspiracy. And Jeffrey O'Brien titles his review of the book Hitler in America. And basically, the whole thing is about conspiracy theories in the way they operate. But Evans, who wrote the book, Hitler's Conspiracy, focuses just on a few of the major conspiracies that the Nazis leveraged in their sort of part of their murderous intent. And it is the anti-Semitic tract, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the first, the second, the stab in the back legend, that Germany's defeat in World War I was due to nefarious attitudes and actions on the home front. Third, the question of who was responsible for the burning of the Reichstag in February of 1933, the parliament, German parliament. And finally, not finally, but there's also this idea of, I think this is another one that he thinks about, what happened to Hitler, right? This idea that the various scenarios in which Hitler, rather than dying in the bunker in Berlin, somehow survived the war. And this is what he writes there. Let me just read you a quote introducing his review. Now, this is not Evans, this is O'Brien writing about Evans's book. He says, conspiracy theories have many functions. They may be tactical weapons wielded against political adversaries, or licenses for every form of revilement and victimization. They may be tools of induction into militant cadres or apocalyptic cults. They may offer seemingly reasoned justifications for already deeply held suspicions and animosities. They may provide entertainment in which any true believer can become an investigator, infiltrator, counter-conspirator, or, if committed enough, perhaps world savior. In the age of the internet, they continue to evolve into a proliferating and constantly mutating combination of scripture and adventure story, readily monetized by hucksters and proselytizers, able to incorporate any arbitrary detail, a reference to takeout pizza in an email, say, and inflate into a building block of a global plot. It is absolutely scary. Things are not going to become better. Things are not going to be easier. So we have to continue to reflect on this important theme. Like, what does it even mean to look after truth or find truth or search for truth in an age where we are both deeply suspicious about official sources of truth, but also when we realize that that kind of suspicion really leads us down a very, very dangerous road towards a very dangerous world. So I want to explore this and think about it with you as we go on. Perhaps to finalize a little bit, I've been also working on my blog where I posted a very important post that I titled The Craft of Living Q&A. And this is going to be like I have another post which is kind of a living document, my basic strategies for, that I wrote down in the context of New Year's resolutions. But for me, a very sort of important charter of how to think about transformation, renewal, change, conversion, turning around of life. I think that's a very important document for me. But this one on the Q&A, the Craft of Living Q&A, is also very important. I'm going to revise it as I go on. I'm asking simple questions, right? What is the craft of living? What is it? Okay, what is it about? what elements does the craft of living entail, and I'm going over some of the things that I've discussed in my episodes, such as any idea the craft of living has to have a vision. Second, there need to be some context-specific goals. There's an encompassing vision, and then there's kind of a very localized sense in terms of the craft of living is always connected with a particular way of life, particular vocation, particular situation, of course. It includes an understanding of human nature. It implies the idea of apprenticeship and craftsmanship, or ascesis. And finally, the craft of living is about acting. And so these 5 elements, right? A certain conception of what a flourishing life is, context-specific goals depending on who you are, where you live. 3, what it means to be a human being. What is like the essence of can we even talk about human nature? Number 3, 4, the idea of apprenticeship. And number 5, the idea of acting. Because in final analysis, the craft of living is about living out these important ideas to act in the world according to the values that we have. I also, in this document, I asked the question, is the craft of living individualistic, neglecting the broader issues of social justice? And my response is, well, how could it ever be that, right? How could it be unless someone's values themselves are narcissistic? The craft of living entails a pursuit of authenticity, namely the commitment to make one's life reflect one's belief. So if you deeply believe about things like empathy and compassion and reaching out and the promoting of justice and healing and shalom in this world, if those are your values, then the craft of living is all about thinking about ways in which you can kind of actualize these things. So I see no opposition between the craft of living and social justice. Okay, so these are the life updates. A lot of moving sort of things happening in terms of research, personal things, some readings I've done and some blog posting, and I hope that was kind of informative, and I'll be building on these things in future episodes as well. But now we're ready to go to our proper theme, which is again on the question of mental fortitude or mental toughness in dialogue with my friend and colleague, Oliver Glanz. In the last 2 episodes, and even before, I tried to make a very self-evident point, or a couple of points. Number 1, that grit or mental fortitude, mental toughness, mental strength is incredibly important. You do not have to be a philosopher, a psychologist, a scientist, a theologian, whatever you are, to be able to realize that is the case. I think that is kind of a universal understanding, right, that we have present in different cultures. And I've given you some illustrations of how that is being either promulgated or encouraged or ritualized. So I think that is a given. Another point that I made as well is that mental toughness is not one thing, right? It consists of several elements. Now, I repeatedly also stress that it doesn't really matter so much what words you use, right? It is quite possible, what I call mental toughness, you use the word grit, and then you kind of just use different words to explain different elements of what grit is. So words don't really matter. But this understanding that whatever we call this quality, I call it mental toughness, that there's the realization that it has a number of things in it. Right? So there's some people who might be strong in one aspect of, well, mental toughness and perhaps weak in some other area. I've talked about that as well. So I was quite interested following my episode that I got an excellent comment from my friend and colleague, Oliver Glanz. Oliver Glanz has a master's in philosophy, and then after that he shifted to more linguistics and biblical studies, and now is a professor of Old Testament. But he is one of those people who have tremendously inspired me. I just told him the other day, whenever I talk to him, I always gain some important insight. I would say actually that a lot of what's happening on this episode, some of these basic ideas that I have, they were inadvertently perhaps sparked on by him. So I'm deeply grateful. I have a huge respect for him, for his commitment to just thinking about life and thinking about philosophy. He is a very avid athlete. I mean, he runs, just these ultra marathons. He, on one occasion, he ran from Berrien Springs, which is Southwest Michigan, to Chicago. He climbed. He's an alpinist. I mean, just a great guy. I admire him very much. So he wrote the following in one of the comments, and the comment as of this moment still is found in YouTube. It is, I think, my episode before this one, where you can read this. But I want to read this because this is an important challenge to me that I seek to respond to. He says, I think one reason for why the building of mental fortitude appears difficult, or is by some perceived as illusionary, has to do with the fact that it is perceived as a means to, or at least essential ingredient for building a well-formed character. Because there's this apparent causal relationship. Mental toughness builds character. Which I think is something that Paul says in Romans, but that's another thing. We're inclined to envision the relationship as methodological. And I want to come back to this question of methodological and how he's using it here. This, however, is the problem, I think. Apparent causalities cannot always be translated into methodologies. And I like this hedging here when he says they cannot always be translated, right? This is sometimes also true for scholarship in other realms of life. I totally agree with that. I would claim that for most of us, the development of mental toughness did not take place in a conscious way, nor did we have a character building in mind. Rather, it was a side effect of playing soccer, climbing a mountaintop, playing ice hockey, preparing for tough exams in school, orienting runs, playing in an orchestra, skiing, having to finish one plate at dinner, preparing for going to church early in the morning, and so on. In all this, we got lost, consumed, mesmerized, or ritualized by the thing we were doing. We were not aware of the pain and discipline we forced upon us in order to pursue what we aimed at. I remember, for example, that as a little team of pathfinders, I was about 14, 15 years old, we were running 30 plus kilometers non-stop, doing an orienting run, crossing creeks, climbing trees, just for the sake of competing with others. Only in the end we realized how much suffering we went through. Or as part of our church's annual night hikes, we kids loved to be dropped in unknown villages, about 20 kilometers away from the church in the dark night with just a bottle of water, a headlamp, and a map in our hands, running back to church over mountains, fields, and forests. And when we arrived, we did not even think about the fact that we had mentally and physically suffered, were sometimes dehydrated during the activity, and so on. The only thing we had in mind, yes, we did it. The same applies to making music, memorizing poems. If you focus on building mental toughness, it is likely you won't develop it. Some things you cannot get by trying to get them. Methodology, which I think then he implies by the using of intentional effort, such as planning or strategies and so on and so forth, is usually not a straight path that follows along the line of causalities. The quality of a good pedagogue is that she realizes this. She knows that the path to the good life is usually disguised. This is an essential truth about the beauty and meaning of life. So when he wrote this, I really thought about it quite a bit. Because in some ways, it really underscores what I believe in, right? I believe that growth and acquiring of skills, attributes, virtues, interests, capacities, competences happens in many instances almost by an osmosis. We just assimilate these things by being placed into right circumstances. I also feel this kind of almost romantic sort of the element to it, right? The stressing on spontaneity and creativity, on providence and serendipity, rather than a mechanistic view of human development, which seems very much like a vision that is a product of the industrial age. And a lot of the life hacks do really sound that way. So I totally get that as well. And so I agree with this. And yet, I was thinking, well, how could I respond to this? Because implicitly, it is a critique of intentionality that for me is implied in the notion of the craft of living. Now, as always, it is quite possible that I have misunderstood this, that my response will not do justice to what Oliver intended in his response. But I'm doing this in this utmost sense of indebtedness and collegiality and the knowledge that he will call me to task if I have misrepresented him in any way. So here's how I would think about this. I would say that what we say about mental toughness or grit, and also when it comes to happiness, right, that we have to look this along several vectors. We have to look several dimensions. Yeah, we have to look at several dimensions in order to unpack what are the causal factors that lead toward the development of grit or mental toughness. Certainly we have to talk about genetics, right? We know that certain personality types, certain the way people operate, in the world, the way they're born, the way they're structured mentally, psychologically, just have a higher set point, resiliency set point than other kids. We can think about the marshmallow experiments, where people have tested the ability of children to have delayed gratification and all of this. And if we could try to explain this all in terms of socialization, or this kid is able to practice delayed gratification because of a particular home environment, while this other kid did not have that home environment. I don't think that's the case. I think actually if you're around babies and small children very early on, you can see significant differences of kids that are more inquisitive or more, strong-willed or more willing to engage in risky behavior. And you can see that. So there definitely is a set point. So there's a lot of also speculation and a lot of studies have been done, right? For instance, another expert is here, not simply in terms of how you're structured, how your psyche is structured genetically as a result of your genetic makeup, but how, for example, let's say trauma and traits are passed on from generation to generation, right? There's something, this idea of epigenetics that, life choices and circumstances lead to different gene expressions. And that's why, for example, you have like identical twins who have lived out, in completely separated at birth, grew up in different circumstances. And when they meet each other, you can truly see significant differences based on their nutrition and other factors. But there's also something called transgenerational epigenetic inheritance, where actually we can inherit the trauma on the genetic level of previous generations. And certainly those kind of things, the ill effects of trauma, such as being perhaps timidity or certain phobias or insecurity, all of that can be come as a result, of this kind of generational transmission. Or if you think about pregnancy, and this we are slowly already moving into the realm of perhaps socialization, we know that the pregnancy, if the mother is pregnant, if the mother is depressed during pregnancy, that will significantly impact the risk of preterm, might lead to preterm delivery and low infant birth weight. And there's also some speculation whether this actually affects the moods of children. Some people have argued, And I'm not a scientist, so I will not die on that particular hill. But I've heard some psychologists argue that it is from the 4th month on of pregnancy that the child identifies with the emotional state of the mother. And that if the mother is sad, that it implicitly develops a sense of the world not being a safe place. Now, I don't want to be too open here and embarrass my family or my brother, but I know that my mom, when she was pregnant with my brother, was deeply depressed. And when he was born, he was more kind of a cranky child and all of that. And the thinking is that somehow perhaps what my mom went through impacted him as a small child. I don't want to speculate, and if Boris, my brother, if you hear this, please, I hope I did not embarrass you. But so there are factors. So obviously, if you're born with a sense the world is not a safe place, right, you will certainly be offered, or you will be on a different level, or you will have a different set point that someone who has not inherited or has not been exposed to trauma of such an age. So genetics for sure determine. Genetics certainly is one of the causal factors of which Oliver writes about. Second is socialization. And I mean, I have to say, when I read this, that this sounded to me like a charmed childhood, right? And I know he grew up in a beautiful part of the world where the nature is absolutely beautiful. So he was given, right? He was given a lot of these opportunities to develop resilience. Some of them were self-generated. He was competing with other friends. In some other instances, they were actually encouraged by leaders. So there was an intentionality by proxy, right? The leaders who dropped them off, 20 kilometers from the church, they knew exactly what they were doing, like fostering and these children to grow, to become independent, to be able to develop situational awareness, endurance, fortitude. So while the kids themselves did not make the decision, right, there was some intentionality behind that. And so we acquire, this is absolutely true, we acquire grit through our parents, teachers, coaches, right? When I was doing water polo and we had to swim these many long distances, it's a very taxing sport. I had no desire to develop grit. I wanted to quit and go home, but I could not. Actually, in one of my blog posts, I write on this experience how we were not doing our best. And so the coach told us next time we had to come with t-shirts into the swimming pool. Now for you, this doesn't mean anything because perhaps you jumped into the water with a t-shirt on and it's all fine. But I tell you, if you have to swim in a t-shirt for an hour and a half, let me just say that, as I put in my blog post, the guys, and I don't think if anyone did it, but guys who put some tape over their nipples had a much better time. For the rest of us, it was red and bloody and the neck was so chafed. It was just a horrible experience. But yeah, of course. So I would not have chosen that, but I have acquired this because the coaches were pushing us, and many of you who were involved in sports, who were kind of encouraged to pursue an instrument and piano, you just acquired certain resilience. But again, right, in many of these instances, there was intent, even though it was by proxy. It was a little bit down the road, upstream, if I can put it that way. At the same time, what Oliver says about these positive effects of socialization and just growing up and being in specific environments, that it cuts both ways. Many people did not have childhoods like this. Many people have been exposed to bullying, to physical abuse by parents. And I grew up in an environment where almost every single day I was called names and was told I would not amount to anything and everything. And for a good portion of my life, when I became older, I had to come to terms with these internal voices. which really create a sense of lack of security, a lack of forwardness, perhaps lack of ambition, lack of trust in myself. And I wonder, right, how many times have I stopped with certain pursuits, with certain goals in my life, because I had this deep-seated sense of insecurity, which I had to come to terms with and deal with it. And so socialization, just my point, cuts both ways. But yeah, it's absolutely true that we are fundamentally determined and influenced by our parents. In his book, Rich Divini tells the story of Hank, of a fellow Navy SEAL operator who, when he was a small kid, on one occasion went to the fridge and took some milk, and then the milk fell and completely everything was splashed on the floor. And his mom came to the kitchen and she saw this and was just red in her face, right? But then Hank noticed how she slowly calmed down and she simply said, okay, take a piece of cloth, let's clean this. And he remembered this for the rest of his life, right? And as well as these important sayings or mantras, which are not philosophies or doctrines, but simple sayings that we acquire that help us in important circumstances. Like his dad would say, always give yourself 2 minutes. 2 minutes to really feel sorry about yourself or feel angry, feel despondent, then turn a leaf and go on. Don't dwell on it. Or you have a promotion, you have something good happening. Yeah, give yourself 2 minutes, be happy, but hey, life goes on. Like, be more this even-keeled approach to life. And he remembered that, and that really helped him later on when he lost, I forgot if it was both of his legs or one of his legs, and it might have been like both, when he stepped on the mine and he had to recover and had prosthetics, Hank, that is, in this story, and how these voices from childhood help him to be resilient. And he eventually ended up competing with his prosthetics. Just an amazing story of resilience. And we have many stories like that. So definitely socialization is important. Very, very important. So I would also say that in addition to then genetics and socialization, there's this element of indirection, right? So where we build grit indirectly, that is already implied in what he stated. It has to do with kind of socialization, education, environment. There was a lot of indirection going on. And that's absolutely true, right? You, for instance, let's say you are determined to have regular time for meditation or a devotional practice, because that's very important, because you need something for health reasons, or you want to have connection with your God, which is for many people very important, as it is for me every morning, right? And you're driven by this desire for this, spiritual quest and spiritual connection with the divine. And it is this persistency that develops in you certain elements of mental toughness, right? Like self-discipline or discipline in general, persistence, perseverance, even when things are going bad, you're still doing it. I'm not doing my devotional life or my times of meditation because I want to have grit. No, but it's true that is kind of a byproduct, right? So I think that is what we need to keep in mind. Also, many things that we have not chosen in life, like when we lose a loved one or we lose something else, a tragedy even, and we somehow find a way to go through that. Like the basic goal is just to collect the bits and pieces that have just fallen apart, right? It tries to just basically to survive. But as a result of trying to find your footing, you develop these qualities. Which brings me to the fourth aspect, which is this idea of direct efforts. And I believe that this is what Oliver has in mind when he writes about methodology. And while I get his critique and get his point of view that he is forwarding, perhaps the difference between the two of us is that I allocate perhaps a greater significance when it comes to that element, to this element of intentionality. Right? Because think about life, right? Think about running. Like, I believe that how we run and how much we can succeed in being runners if this is kind of something we do for in competitive sports. I think genetics certainly contribute to that, right? I believe that socialization, meaning other people, models, training, all of that will contribute to that, right? Did they have a good coach? Did they have a good environment where I could practice and develop? Certainly will be there. How much have I run? I also believe that we develop these skills unintentionally, right? Indirectly. I believe that proper sleeping and nutrition, all of these things contribute to our physical fitness. But you can have all of this and still have problems with the biomechanics of your running. Perhaps you ran your whole life. And yet if a coach, someone who is really an expert, watches how you run, they might detect all kinds of problems. Right? You don't have a straight posture, your head is not kind of centered properly, your gait is too short or too long, or you're hitting your stride, you're hitting your pavement with your heel instead of the midfoot or front of the foot, whatever, right? I'm not a runner, so I will stop here with that. And so I think if you then directly practice, you get in some exercises, you become better at running, even though running is the most natural activity that we acquire. Yeah, I used to swim a lot. I grew up, as I said, in a competitive, I played competitively water polo. But even later in life, I read some books on swimming and I realized that for the whole of my life, I made mistakes. I did not swim as I was supposed to swim, even though I was the guy who was on our team, always swimming in water polo, though that the game starts when the referee drops the ball in the middle and then two guys are swimming and then they try to get the ball. I was the guy on our team who swam for the ball because I was the second fastest person on the team. But even later on in life, I realized that I made some mistakes. So I read some books and then I would go to the pool and I would practice, my movement in the body, the rotating movement and all of that. I don't have to go into this. And so I was doing exercises as a result of that. I became better. I believe a similar thing happens with resilience. Right? We develop resilience, we acquire it, we have models, we are being coached. There's an osmosis going on. But then you grow up, right? And you become self-aware about areas of your life in which you are perhaps not excelling. Or you hear a mantra or a saying by someone, let's say like David Goggins, right? His famous saying that all of us, basically when we say that we are done, that we cannot go on, right? Cannot go on, we possibly have used only 40% of our capacities, right? And that stuck with me. This is something I learned and I tried to memorize it. And so on many an occasion, when I felt like giving up, that sort of idea comes to my mind, which I repeated, which I read about, which I wrote down, which I learned about. And I would say this to myself and it would give me strength and I would continue. And we could give innumerable instances where those kind of intentional efforts, either by remembering, by having certain visions of who we want to be, I want to become more courageous. Hey, because if that could not help, then therapy would not help, right? People have phobias and they come to therapy and as a result of that, they have this kind of incremental exposure. I think there's a more technical term for this. Like, you are afraid of spiders and then the therapist puts like a tiny projection of a tiny spider on the wall and you become kind of, the word is eluding me right now, but you become more desensitized to the fear, right? To the object of fear. And then, bigger spider, slightly bigger spider, and slowly. And obviously then you are actually becoming more resilient when it comes to that particular phobia. You become more courageous, if I can put it that way, in facing that initial object of fear. So I believe then that in acquiring proper values, right, you grow up and you have proper values, and for you now you're sick and tired of being always weak, always late. I used to be a minister And, I would procrastinate sometimes with my sermons. I have to be honest. And instead of starting on time, I would start a little bit too late. And then I would preach perhaps at 80% of my capacity, let's say, right? I became so sick and tired of that I made a direct decision that I might not be a great preacher, but I don't want to preach at 80% of my capacity simply because I'm always late. The same is with papers, the same is with other things in life. Right? That is a direct decision because I had a certain value, right? I had a value and a vision that I developed, right? I believe that fostering things like gratitude is something that we can foster. And we know that a positive mindset, right, certainly will help us in terms of resilience, in terms of bouncing back, in terms of having a growth mindset. And that is something I can directly do. And if there's anything in my life that I can really say that I've grown in the last 20 years, it is that I definitely am not the negative person I used to be, complaining about this, complaining about that, and coming from a family of complainers. So it took me a long time to uproot that. And that has had kind of a domino effect, a very important thing. So that was something that was done directly, right? Watching my speech, if I decide directly that I will watch my speech because I believe that words create reality. And so if you're down and you want to give up, the knowledge, I've read about this. So I determined right now, I've learned this, right? I'm determined when I'm down not to put this into the world, right? These words into the world by which I create a reality, which then lead me perhaps to give up. I think that is incredibly important. And when you realize that we talk to ourselves in any given minute, between 300 and 1,000 words, we don't even notice this, but this internal conversation is always going on. And so perhaps to become more aware of that conversation and start using a different script, I think that is a type of direct effort. In any case, I could go on and talk a lot about these issues, give different illustrations in which acquiring specific mantras, or specific sayings, specific rules of living, like thinking about and journaling about interactions and decisions, how intentionally having a great awareness of yourself, becoming more acquainted with the areas of weakness, how that all speaks to the effort element of direct intervention that we have. Now, again, I want to end here because I think I've said enough about mental toughness for now anyway, and I hope that I did not completely misconstrue what Oliver wanted to express, and I'm so deeply grateful for his comment. Just an amazing, the fact that he took the time to write this. But I think that I agree with him, and yet for me, while I recognize the element of genetics and the element of socialization, and the element of indirect effort, that for me, in acquiring any craft and any competency, there is always something about a vision. There's something about a goal. There's something about understanding of how you need to go about that to achieve this goal. There is some element of after-action reports where you think, well, how did I do that? Right? And all of that speaks to me that acquiring grit has to do with the acquiring of these things, having these things, and certainly habits. So I want to end here, because now I could easily talk about habits quite a bit, but I want to end here by asking a simple question. Like, what does mental toughness mean for you? Right? That is a very individualized question. Because I have tremendous areas of weakness and I have perhaps some areas of strength, as all of us have. So how are we going to address them? Let's say everything is what Oliver said, right? This is what life has done to us, this is what we have done, and right now, this is who I am. Now what do I do now? Right? How do I rectify some of these things? Or perhaps you can take small steps, right? Perhaps you can make a decision to go 1 month without missing a workout. For someone who is very sporadic in exercising, that might be a huge thing. Or how about, going 1 week without eating processed or packaged food. Or if you drink soda for every meal, not to drink it for one meal. Right? What would it be for you? Like delivering your work, if you're a student, if you do anything, right? Your work ahead of schedule rather than procrastinating. And having regular devotional meditative practices. Like having a +1 principle in any circumstance where you look at what is the one thing in this circumstance that I don't want to do. Like all these things would be very good ways in which we could enlarge our kind of grit powers in daily existence. Or perhaps a commitment to call a friend every week. Or the decision to spend something creative. So we are now moving into the realm of mini choices, mini habits in order to address and perhaps build ourselves our capacity for grit and resilience. So I think I had enough. I want to stop here. This has gone on quite, it's been a longish episode, but I wanted to do justice, as I said, to what Oliver wrote. But thank you so much again for listening to this. I wish you truly all the best, and whatever challenges you're facing, stay strong, don't give up, be resilient, be strong, and have a mindset. This is another example, right? Have a mindset of which I talked before. But right here, I have an opportunity. Like, right, good, this is happening. Right now, I can grow through this and use it as a challenge, whatever it is, rather than a sort of life-crushing circumstance. In any case, until next week, all the best, stay strong, live well, and goodbye.